Our next speaker is Arzu Mistry. She is an Associate Dean at Srishti Institute of Art, Design and Technology and is a Research Associate at Center for Education, Research, Training and Development. She is an educator, visual artist and dancer. She maintains a high level of dedication and enthusiasm for the arts and place-based socio-ecological practices as mediums for pedagogy, advocacy, transformation and intervention for the building of sustainable, inclusive communities. Her practice connects educators, youth, and families with place using memory, story, play, and art making. She works with diverse audiences through interdisciplinary education and community art ecology projects, livelihood training, teacher professional development, and education research and practice. Thank you for being a part of today's session, ma'am. I invite you to present your talk.
Thank you. My talk today is going to be quite different from Swati's and Kush's. I'm really inspired by the practices that you both have shared today and the dynamics of community-based work that are interrelational, that have so much exchange going on between all of the parties involved, and at the same time are external manifestations of all of the complexities, as you raised, Kush, of power, of relationality, of community-based work that both of you have raised. I'm going to be talking about something quite different today, and as an artist and educator, I'm really interested in the internal processes that young design students go through. And today, the work that I am going to be sharing has to do more with making books like this than kind of community-based work, which is a big part of my practice. For much of my professional life, I felt that my artist self and my educator self were functioning as two separate beings. And it was really only in the space of the work that I'm sharing today, which started about 15 years ago, where research and inquiry became these overlapping spaces of my artwork and my education practice. As an educator, I have taught kindergarten to postgraduate students, and I have to say that my favorite group of kids, of people to teach, are third graders on one hand and graduate students on the other. Partly because both of them really see themselves as practitioners. They see themselves as artists or designers or curators or makers, and not just as students. What third graders and postgraduate students have in common is a hunger for making meaning of the world around them, with a deep curiosity and an inquiry mindset through their own creative practice. They don't see themselves merely as students on a receiving end of other people's practice. And the practice that I'm going to share today is called the Accordion book practice. And it's one that I use with third graders and my PhD students. And in my own practice, as well as in my community-based work. I make books. I encourage other people to make books. And I use them in my community-based projects, like Aliye was mentioning the Memory Maps project yesterday, and in the work that I do with Art in Transit, which is a project with the Bangalore Metro, and where our students have been working with the Bangalore Metro now for the last 6-7 years. I'm really interested in the internal processes of meaning making that young people go through. And the work that I'm going to be sharing today is about that. And I think it would be an interesting conversation after this, the juxtaposition about the external work, the internal work, and all of the complexities that come from community-based practice and meaning making. So I'm going to share my screen, and I want to say up front that I'm going to be going between my slides and some videos. I will also share in the chat a link to kind of a YouTube playlist. If the videos that I play are not so clear, you can mute and, kind of, I'll tell you which one to go to. So just give me a second to share my slides. All right. So I make books, and these books are not, kind of like a traditional book. They are artist books, they are process journals, they are research journals. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about the ways that I support others in making these books, and also the ways that I've developed this as my personal research method, and in terms of keeping track of my thinking and my questions. But before that, today I'm talking not as an architect. Most people here are architects, and yes, I have architecture in my blood. I have my parents sitting right next to me, Renu and Arzu Mistry. Today I'm going to be talking about art practice, and this sits a little bit differently from design practice, but there's a big buzz right now about art-based research, and these words in blue that I've put out here. So I want to talk a little bit about why research and why art-based research. So curiosity, inquiry, research has become ways that we get to know our world. And if you think about any discipline, whether it's geology or astronomy, whether it's civics or bioethics, all these disciplines study various ways to make meaning of the world around us. Research in all disciplines is inquiry into the unknown and the construction of new knowledge. Rigorous academic research could stem from a search to understand a problem, to find things out, to see things in new ways, to take action in new ways. The new knowledge typically extends and shapes the discipline itself. We think about research primarily in the sciences and social sciences and design research now that has been shared. And but there is a kind of a preconceived notion that art is about a making practice. It's about making aesthetic objects, and it's not necessarily widely acknowledged as a way of thinking. But there is a paradigm shift that's happening from orthodox notions of art practice that is primarily about object making or developing a personal style or mastering a technique. And art practice is seen now as ways that artists encounter, interpret, and build understanding of the world around them. In other words, art making is seen as inquiry, and some have accepted this as a form of research. Especially in the kind of work that Kush and Swati were sharing, and artists that now work with site-specific, place-based, community-based, issue-based art, there is a new generation of research-oriented artists taking the union of art and social science and calling attention to their art practice as research, or making their art practice about research. Artist research methods become cross-disciplinary, and art becomes acknowledged as a way to understand phenomena and also the human condition, understanding of issues of social consequence. How do we identify ourselves? How do we come to understand each other and relate to each other? How can we use art practice to generate and collect data is becoming more and more commonly accepted. In art practice research, the analytical, rational, linear thinking is combined with non-linear associative thought in what we call poetic logic. The art practice itself, whatever it might be, is at the heart of the methodology of the process. Art practice researchers ask questions that are explored and answered through the practice. One need not just think oneself out of a problem, but rather practice one's way to a solution. And this becomes really becoming aware of the thinking that happens by making. So, I love the work of Linda Barry, because she really brings this idea of poetic logic to the fore. Linda Barry is a cartoonist, and she's an educator. And these are two spreads from a book of hers called What It Is. And she asks these questions: what are thoughts? What is reflection? How does it come about? And she explores these ideas through collage, through text, through the juxtaposition of text and image, not necessarily trying to find an answer right away, but to explode the question further. So these are some questions that I'm often asking with my students, especially in the creative education program that I run at Srishti. How do you go from taking a bunch of art classes to developing an art practice? What is that switch? And how do we support students in developing their own practice? And to me, research and inquiry and an awareness of self as a researcher or an inquirer is very much a part of this process. Also, another question, how does documentation help us know? And this is, comes to the crux of the work that I'm going to be sharing today. So my colleague and I, Todd Elkin, and I run a project called the Accordion Book Project, and it's really about developing an inquiry practice and keeping track of your thoughts and your inquiry. A couple of years ago, we put together an artist book about the various methods that we had developed over a 10-year period of time of working with teachers and students. And, we run workshops and take some of the ideas and the methods that I'm going to be sharing with you today with a variety of students of various age groups. So I'm going to pause and give an introduction to this practice through kind of sharing a video. And
Arzu,
yes.
Sorry to interrupt, but could you put your slides in presentation mode the next time you share them? Because
it was in presentation mode. Did you not see that?
No. That's
really strange because I couldn't see anything. It was filling my full screen.
I know. The next time you share the slides.
Were you able to see the slides move?
No, they weren't moving.
Oh no.
Yeah, that was. I guess once we see the video, perhaps we could go through the slides one more time, if that's okay.
Oh, I'm terribly sorry. I
No,
wish you had
sorry
stopped
about
me
that.
earlier.
I didn't know when to interrupt. So yeah, go on with the
Okay.
video.
That seems strange because, well, okay, let's see if you're able to see the video. So let me know if you're able to see the video.
Sure.
You're going to need to let me know if you can hear and see the video. Okay.
Definitely, yes.
All right.
I can see the video. Not able to. Yeah, but can you increase the volume?
Are you able to hear it?
Yes.
Okay, let's see here.
For tracking and creating network maps of your thinking and your creative practice. We use Accordion books to capture, visualize, build, and reflect on our practice. When you physically construct your thinking, building between text and image, physically connecting and extending ideas, you begin to build a mental networked map of your thinking. Networked thinking that does more to build connections between ideas and less to segment and categorize them. Knowledge is constructed in associated ways with other knowledge. And this super simple and versatile base structure of the accordion fold is a beautiful opportunity for the meeting of form and function. Hi, I'm Arzu Mistry and I enjoy making books. And today I'm going to share a little bit about an accordion book practice that I use. So I make accordion books for artistic practice, and I also make accordion books for reflection, for research, for documentation. And for many years, I've used to keep sketchbooks and journals that are typical books. And I found it really hard to keep track of my thinking. I found it hard to find things in the many sketchbooks that I had. And I also found it hard to connect things that were on page 5 and on page 25, but were about the same idea. So I wanted to devise a way where I could physically map my thinking process. And I turned to the simple accordion for that. I love the accordion for many reasons. One is that it's really very basic, but very versatile. I can work across sheets of paper, as you can see there. So I can work across the frame. And wherever I want to, I can start to add flaps and extensions to build my ideas in different directions. So the accordion book works like a map of my thinking, and the ability for this simple accordion is that it also has the potential to be three-dimensional. With this very, very, very simple structure, I realized that I am able to build my thinking as it happens, layer by layer, and I have found it extremely useful for my reflective practice. Working with teachers and students over the last 10 years, we've used the simple accordion and support it with various processes and strategies for documentation, collection, planning, creating, and reflecting. The practice itself focuses on empowering the learner to make these books their own, developing their own strategies to connect their hands and their minds, their inner and outer worlds, and in that way develop agency over their own learning. So in this series of videos, I want to share how to make accordion books and why I do make accordion books for reflective practice.
All right. Was everybody able to see that?
Yes,
Okay, and were you able to hear that?
absolutely. Sorry about the slides. We could not see them moving, but this was perfect. Yes.
That's very strange. I'm going to try that again. I'm going to try and present the slides again, and I would like you to just stop me if you can't see it moving.
Okay.
Okay?
Yes.
All right. So I'm going to play it, and then I'm going to, can you see this full screen?
It's not full screen right now. It's that's something.
Okay.
But the slides are moving. I can see the slides move.
So were you able to see the slides moving earlier, or you weren't able to see the slides moving earlier?
I weren't able to see. We could not see the slides moving earlier.
Okay, I don't know what to do because I have presented it. It's in presentation mode and it's in full screen mode. So I'm not sure if I should keep it this way now that you are able to see it and just kind of
please, that should be fine. Yeah, we can see the slides move now. So that is good.
So I'll just kind of recap. I was sharing with you the work of Linda Barry, who uses collage and text to explore ideas. And I was sharing with you a couple of questions that me and my students are really engaged with in terms of looking at kind of creative practice. In watching the video that was shared, I just want to pose these questions to you, and we'll discuss this later during the question and answer. But what are the methods you use to keep track of your thinking and your creative process? How do you make your thinking visible to yourself and others? What tools do you use to support your thinking and research process? What tools do you use to challenge your thinking and your research process? So these are some of the questions that I have been trying to explore with this accordion book practice. And these are some, very quick excerpts of other people's accordion books as we've worked with them over the years, just so you could get a visual sense of this. Part of what I am really interested as a researcher and an educator is this relationship between making and thinking. And this image kind of shares a schematic of the relationship between the mind and the hand. And it's actually put out by Goldsmiths, looking at the dynamics of prototyping and what does prototyping help young designers, in their design process. And the importance of to be making right from the beginning of any kind of design process or design research process, and how making furthers thinking, furthers making, furthers thinking, furthers making. A lot of times I have to battle with my students who want to come up with a plan and then start. And I have to tell them, no, you know what, you need to start making right off the bat. You need to start playing with material right off the bat. And, I want to read a segment from Bruce Metcalf and his book, The Hand at the Heart of Craft. Because a lot of times what I'm battling with my students today is that, oh yeah, I've taken photographs, or I've taken notes on my computer, and the question is, why bother to make anything by hand today?
Yeah.
So why bother to make anything by hand today when cutting edge technology is moving towards the complete automation of manufacturing? Why bother when you can buy so many inexpensive and efficient things that function so well? Why bother with all this messy, laborious, and highly demanding work? Isn't it stupidly nostalgic and obsolete, or nearly so? Shouldn't we let handwork die a quiet death and get on with our 21st century lives without looking back? To answer this question, I'll start with the hand itself. Most of us have two of them, and generally we take them for granted, but they are quite marvelous instruments. The hand doesn't really end at the wrist because it is connected to a network of tendons, muscles, and bones that extend all the way to the spine. The hand also contains a dense array of nerve endings, which are rooted to the spinal cord and then to many different areas of the brain. So it is now theorized that the hand use, language use, and cognition all developed and evolved interdependently. You can regard the hand as an instrument of language and an extension of the brain. Each one probably influenced the other, and each becomes a part of our unique biological nature. So part of the work with the accordion book practice is really the idea that you are constructing your thinking, and you're developing networked maps of your thinking with your hand, and the embodied nature of that hand and your thinking process and your making meaning process of the world around you are all intricately linked. So I'm going to kind of go into some of the practices of the accordion book process a little bit more. But just before we start, I want to share a little bit more about why I use this practice with my students and students of different ages as a way to develop their own relationship to what they are thinking and doing in a very tactile manner. So here I'm sharing, 5 processes, 5 approaches, and each of them have their methods that we share and we support. And they're not necessarily linear. They're not in an order, but they can be used and circled around and come back to in different ways. So I'm going to start with Things Talk to Me. And I'll start with a quote from Alexandra Horowitz and her book On Looking, 11 Walks with Expert Eyes. So she says, I was paying so little attention to most of what was right before us that I had become a sleepwalker on the sidewalk. What I saw and attended to was exactly what I expected to see. What my dog, who was her companion, her walking companion, what my dog showed me was that my attention invited along with attention's companion inattention to everything else. So one of the first processes that I really encourage my students, and again, young people of all ages, is to be alert to the things that talk to you and catch and hold your attention. And 2 ideas that I want to share here is one, the idea of grabbiness. What catches and holds your attention? Things we notice can be visual or conceptual. They can be repulsive or they can be attractive. We call these things grabby. Something is holds your attention. Becoming alert and looking for themes and patterns in the things we notice is the beginning of a journey. Start collecting things that grab and hold your attention. In the current Indian scenario in terms of education, we're taught that the teacher knows what's right or the parent knows what's right. And sometimes kids are taught out of observation or deep looking. They're taught that what they observe or what they think of as valuable or interesting in the landscape is not that important. And observation, is seen as secondary to abstraction. So there's a retraining that needs to happen. And a lot of times the way I position this is asking young people to use themselves as a compass. A critical part of this practice is transferring agency from teacher to the learner. Be it a third grader or a college student, the sooner one starts to feel like an artist and not just as an art student, the better. As students, we're constantly doing projects dictated by someone else. How do we move into doing projects for ourselves? The baby steps towards this is to trust oneself, trust one's observations that are valid, and trust that what you are observing and what you are drawn to and what you get bothered by are all important clues and paths to your own practice. The gentle step of starting this process is to use yourself as a compass and be alert and make visible how you respond to the world. So, much of this practice is really about helping people start building collections of the things that catch and hold their attention. So here, these are some of my own collections of leaves, and I've cut them out and I'm color matching them. But also this relationship of form and function. All of my accordion books have pockets in them. And the pockets are great for building collections, for things that you pick up, whether it's newspaper cuttings or whether it's objects or seed pods, etc. These are all fantastic things to start collecting. And then from building a pocket, you start the process of sorting and categorizing and relating and all of that. But the first is to trust that your observations are valuable. The next part of that process, or the part of the process that we encourage people to think about, is mapping. And Swati had already spoken about mapping. But when we think about mapping, mapping opens up a whole way of re-seeing the world in ways that we did not expect. So I want to start with a quote from Peter Turchi, and this is from his book, Maps of the Imagination, Writer as Cartographer. And he says, we organize information on maps in order to see our knowledge in new ways. As a result, maps suggest explanations, and while explanations reassure us, they also inspire us to ask questions and consider other possibilities. To ask for a map is to say, tell me a story. Mapping is a many-layered metaphor for sorting and reflecting. To map is to document, to give shape to explore, to guide, to relook, to make a symbolic representation of your thinking, to get lost, and crucially, to interpret and make meaning. There are many terrains that we map. We were looking at many examples with Kush and Swati's work of the different kinds of terrains. But artistic creation is a voyage into the unknown. And in our eyes, we're often off the map. The excitement of potential discovery is accompanied by anxiety, despair, caution, perhaps boldness, and always the risk of failure. Failure can take the form of becoming hopelessly lost or pointlessly lost, not finding where you came from, for the thought that lasts is sometimes happily accompanied by the discovery of something we didn't anticipate, couldn't even imagine before we found it. We strike out for what we believe to be uncharted waters, only to find ourselves sailing in someone else's bathtub. Those are the days that it seems that nothing new to discover but the limitations of our own experience and understanding. And I share this quote partly because as an artist or a designer, what we need to encourage our students is to try and find that edge of the unknown, the edge of what we know. And Kenya Hara is a Japanese designer, and in his book, X-Formation, he says, what moves people's hearts in every case is the unknown. He challenges designers saying, instead of showing more of what we know, how can design help us unknow the world? So the methods of the Accordion Book Project are really about trying to get us to the edge of what we know. And I want to kind of end this segment with a quote from Rebecca Solnit from her Field Guide to Getting Lost. The nature of which is totally unknown to you is usually what you need to find, and finding it is a matter of getting lost. Getting lost was not a matter of geography so much as identity, a passionate desire, even an urgent need to become no one and anyone. So part of the value of this practice is the meeting of form and function, the ability for us to build and construct networked and mapped thinking and sorting and sifting and moving our material around in various ways. And I'm going to stop sharing and share another kind of short video to just expand on this idea of mapping. So you're going to have to tell me again if you are able to see and hear. Okay, let's see here. Okay, so let me know if you're able to hear this.
Okay.
So the next phase or
Yes.
the next approach I want to
Okay.
draw attention to is the approach of mapping. And Todd and I call this mapping the terrain, exploring. This requires a very different mode. It's a mode not of gathering and collecting, which is things talk to me, but it's a mode of spending time, expanding, revisiting, sorting, connecting, marking, building. There's two kinds of mapping, right? There's the embodied mapping, which is really more in a flow. It's more the act of exploration. And then there is a more analytical mapping, which is about sorting, about connecting, about marking, etc. And I want to mark that when we map, part of it is this act of exploration. Part of it is the act of guiding, and part of it is the act of getting lost. And I want to read a quote, and this is from Rebecca Solnit's The Field Guide to Getting Lost. That thing, the nature of which is totally unknown to you, is usually what you need to find. And finding it is a matter of getting lost. Getting lost was not a matter of geography so much as identity. A passionate desire, even an urgent need to become no one and anyone. So while you're mapping, there are a couple of strategies to point out. One of the strategies is to start developing visual metaphors. That's a house that you see there. Visual metaphors for things that come up over and over again. So I have a house stencil that I've made, and you'll see that this house comes up over and over again because another thing that I am alert to and catches and holds my attention, it's also part of my research, is looking at migration and the dynamics of migration and people's relationship to place. And here in this book, place, belonging, inclusive, are things that come up as themes for me. And I even set up some codes in here that allow me to code my thinking, these color-coded dots that allow me to code my thinking as I'm engaging in some amount of mapping that takes place. The mapping might happen across multiple books. This mapping around migration for me is been years. I've been thinking about it for over 10 years. So you'll see aspects of it through your book, and they become a code through your book. You know where things are because there's a visual metaphor that continues to develop across your books. But there's also some other strategies, right? So of developing these, and part of it is here right now in this current crisis, India has been there's been a lot of dynamics around migration that we have been struggling with, and I have been expanding many different aspects of that. But here, as you can see, the strategy I've used is just playing with scale. Things that are really important, I've kind of made them larger in scale in terms of text, but I've also developed a couple of other visual metaphors. These feet that I use this stamp for are migrants on the move. So you see this visual metaphor of the house. I have drawn from Sean Tan's Arrival, which is an amazing book, and I've also developed another visual metaphor. So all of these acts, whether it's manipulation of scale, whether you're working with text, whether you're developing a visual metaphor, be it the foot or the house in this case, or developing color codes, These allow you to keep track of your mapping.
All right, so I'm gonna stop sharing that and go back to my slides. And I'm gonna wrap this up in a short bit here. So, just drawing attention to mapping in a variety of ways, taking things that we collect, sorting, revisiting, starting to code them. And, the next process that we really encourage is that of exchange. And I want to share this Margaret Wheatley quote, which she says, "Talk to people you know, talk to people you don't know, talk to people you've never talked to. Be intrigued by the differences you hear, expect to be surprised. Treasure curiosity more than certainty." The words exchange evoke diverse ideas from love, gift, argument, garage sale, collaboration, globalization. We're hardly conscious of the many daily exchanges we make within the capital, social, and redistributive economic systems that we live in. Exchanges of power in the classroom, in workspaces, and between individuals are happening all the time. Kush, alluded to this. Relationships in nature are sometimes mutually beneficial, sometimes exploitative, sometimes parasitic, and often transformative in both positive and negative ways. Looking at the various dynamics and qualities of these different types of interpersonal exchanges can reveal a lot about the degrees of democracy, who is empowered, who isn't disempowered, what new forms and ideas are arising out of these exchange. No ideas or work exist within a vacuum, and they come from different kinds of exchanges. And how can we make exchanges visible and use it as a generative lens when we look at our practice as designers, artists, educators, and world citizens? So, in the video, I was talking about these yellow dots, and I started using these yellow dots as a way to start coding every time I was aware of exchanges, partly because of that exchanges are so complex. They are needed in our world, in our complex world, and yet they are so rife with political dynamics, with class dynamics, caste dynamics, with power. And a lot of times when we are engaging, and I started off with observation, we form judgment right on top of observation. We don't give observation time to just sit. And part of marking these is to be able to say, okay, where can I create space between observation and judgment? Because when we're engaging with the world around us, we're all constantly needing to make judgment and judging situations just personally for our own safety and also navigation. But research requires us to create space between observation and judgment. It's between and judgment that questions, that methods, that theories, that thinking about assumptions, all of these fall into place. So part of noting and marking and coding things that are coming up and themes that are coming up is that they allow for this opening up and the ability to take perspective, which comes very much from this dynamic of exchange. The next, kind of segment is, what would an artist do? And here we're all a bunch of designers, and part of the reason why I kind of foreground artists is because artists are not necessarily trying to solve world problems, although many are also, but there is this real proactiveness in terms of the way they engage with world. And I like this Paul Chan quote where he says, "The art I admire the most is the kind I understand the least and keep on not understanding. It shows uncompromisingly that another world is possible, and neither the world the 99% struggles with nor the one enjoyed by the 1% are good enough to settle for." Contemporary artists and designers are excellent role models. They are proactive, they are self-driven free agents, they're fired up, in that there is a palatable sense that they are compelled to do what they do and have an extremely high level of engagement and sense of purpose about their work. They develop a variety of ways to make meaning of the world around them, and as an educator, I would love nothing more than to help ignite this kind of drive and purposiveness in myself and my students. Artist expression are an act of making meaning of their world. They synthesize, envision, reframe, catalyze, trigger, juxtapose, persuade, inform, translate, narrate, hybridize, analyze, bridge, connect, invent, predict, play tricks, observe, critique, provoke, think systematically, inquire creatively, and explore multiple perspectives. Here, within this space of what would an artist do, I am really interested in the journey that artists and designers go through, and very particularly for my students, from going from no idea to an idea and to action. What is that process? How do we start to reflect and make visible that process? And a lot of times that comes through a type of mapping for yourselves, for oneself, the artist I am, the artist I want to be, mapping for myself, putting on various lenses to look at my work and my process. I'm gonna play this, and again, Salila, I want you to let me know if you can see this, because it's just a quick kind of stop motion.
Yes.
Okay. Are you able to see this, and is it moving?
It's not moving it, but I can see it for sure.
Okay, I guess that's not going to work. So I'm going to just skip this then. Well, I'm playing it, and for some reason it's not. Are you able to see it move, or no? It's not.
No, it's not moving.
Okay. All right.
I think it's because of the way you've shared your screen. If you unshare and share again, it might help.
Okay.
Just share your entire screen. You might be getting two options, right, when you share.
Right. So I share my entire screen versus a window. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think that will help.
Okay. All right. Let's try that. Sorry about this. Okay. All right. Okay, let's see if this works. Are you able to see this now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I should have done this a while ago then. Now we know. So looking at, how do we keep track of our process? How do we keep track of our micro processes? What our strengths, our challenges are? What is our growing edge? What does it take? What are the pathways that we need to take in our own personal practice? And then how do we start to look at it through the different lenses of our own fields? So looking at it from the habits of mind of an artist, and looking at, how do we develop these pictures of artistic mind? So these are just, again, tools and strategies to engage in that process. Can you see this? Is the next slide on?
Yes, it is.
Great. I should have done this at the very beginning. Thank you for now pointing it out.
I'm sorry, I should have pointed it out earlier.
Okay.
But we could see everything, so that's good. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm gonna come to a close now. But one of the things that is a really interesting research question for myself is how do artists get out of their own way? So, Rebecca Solnit was saying that artists and designers kind of try and get to this edge of what they know, and they have to push themselves into the space of getting lost. Yet, as human beings, that is very uncomfortable for us, and we are constantly pulling ourselves back from this whole space of getting lost. And we need to be able to get out of our own way in order for us to really engage with this sense of letting go, with this sense of flow, with this sense of new possibilities. And sometimes there are, there's this pervasive noise that comes up from, what box are we in, what category are we in, and we need to get away from all that. And artists are constantly developing strategies to get out of their own way and trust the process and resist closure. So, these are just quotes to share. Sometimes when I make work, there is a moment when when what I want to make and what I make it with fuse in such a way that the piece begins against my intention to take a form of its own. It is as though I am no longer the prime mover. At this point, what is in front of me becomes as strange to me as I am essentially to myself. This is the point where I'm always trying to reach. And Yo-Yo Ma says, at the moment of presentation, this is as a performer, The whole point of performance is to have the confidence to lose your inhibition, because you get rewarded. You don't get rewarded for trying. You do not get rewarded for being inhibited. And when you go from having to do something to wanting to do something, only you know where that switches. And the more you actually know where that switches for yourself, the more you can be incredibly joyous. And I like the way he says this, go from wedding to wedding night. So, this kind of part of developing strategies to get out of one's own way is really an important part of the practice and of artists. And it's been really interesting for us in the work that we do, talking to artists and really gathering. This is definitely a research question that I have, and really gathering ways and methods that artists get out of their own way. So I'm going to end of kind of reading this poem from Lao Tzu, just as I'm sorry, can you hear? I think that there's an echo. Somebody maybe needs to mute.
Dinesh, can you mute yourself?
Yeah, I'll just do that.
Okay. So everybody on earth knowing that beauty is beautiful makes ugliness. Everybody knowing that goodness is good makes wickedness. For being and non-being arise together. Hard and easy complete each other. Long and short shape each other. High and low depend on each other. Note and voice make the music together. Before and after follow each other. That's why the wise soul does without doing, teaches without talking. The things of this world exist. They are. You can't refuse them. To bear and not to own, to act and not to lay claim, to do the work and let it go. For just letting it go is what makes it stay. I'll share some of these resources if they're interesting for students. And they're all on our website, which is the accordionbookproject.com. So I'm going to stop sharing here, and yes, I've shared in the chat a link to some of the other videos that you can look at about the project.
Thank you so much, Kush, Swati, and Arzu, for presenting us with these thought-provoking ideas. And thank you very much, Arzu, for these wonderful references. A lot of our students who are present in this talk are in the process of embarking on their thesis journeys. So these sessions with you all are definitely, it will definitely add in a lot of richness onto their processes. So my initial question or provocation is for all of you. Drawing on what Kush spoke about, the idea of co-liberation and trust while working with a community or even students, as Arzu pointed out. And when Swati sort of highlighted that the process of architectural production involves the idea of building relationships over time, and a lot of her talk was also about that. So it's sort of, in one of my conversations with a colleague in SEPT about working with communities as a student, and he told me that in the 80s, when they were working in the Hollywood Basti region with the Rawari community near SEPT, a group of them would go every other day to map and document their lifestyles. But for a long time, they weren't allowed to go inside, inside the Basti. They were just, at the threshold. And only after a while, slowly the girls within the group were invited into the Basti across the threshold for a hair oil massage. And the boys in the group were, sitting on the khatiyas, and the men tied pagdis for them, right? So it sort of got me thinking about this idea of trust and co-liberation that, you all spoke of today. And yesterday, Alia is something that she spoke about the body as a tool, in the research process. So would you have any of these stories, in the act of building trust from your own practices? Maybe a collection of moments when you felt co-liberated or co-empowered. And as Arzu spoke of the idea of getting lost, in terms of identity. I hope I know it was a long question, but I hope you sort of got the gist of it.
maybe I can kind of jump in and start to respond to that. I think that Kush alluded to it, and I think very much so in the work that young people go out and do. There's so much emotion that is involved when you put yourself out there in the world, and there is this kind of moral thing of doing good, or a lot of times people call it the savior complex. And a lot of times when I am working with students, I ask them to develop a context map for themselves first before they go into the field, because I think that for students to understand where they sit, or to even have a reference point, and it's not that I am just a benign do-gooder in a situation. How am I understanding where I am? What am I going through emotionally? What am I going through as I am vulnerable in this space? Yet, what are all my privileges? What do I come with? What do I have access to? And how am I aware of that? So, part of this process and the strategies that we use is really doing a context map of yourself, for yourself, and sharing that with each other, and having these conversations with each other before we go out into the field, to do work, so that there is some awareness of one's own upbringing and one's own context.
Yeah, I can add to that. I think what Kush said about trust building and also honesty is what I'm going to pick up on, and I think that's the most important thing. And now any work we do in a place where we are new, the people don't know us, we always go through an organization which has worked with them for years, knows them, and they trust them. Where we build this school, Yamuna Khadar, of course, we knew some of the people, but most of the relationships we built over time ourselves. But it also made us realize, how the processes could be done better. But at the same time, I also think that when it comes to students, students have a pass to make mistakes, and I think you should use that pass really, because I just recall my conversations with the students at Ambedkar University, the master's program in social design. And after we talk about marginalization and privilege, and I think all the concepts which are very new for them, and as they're internalizing all this, they get so handicapped. They just get so paralyzed. Sorry, not handicapped, just okay, same thing, similar, but just because they feel that there is no right way that they can do this. Like, they just don't think that they can, go out there, talk to people, and, still not be making a mistake on, how they need to be sensitive, and how, ethical their practice is, or, their research is or is not. And I think as long as you're not extractive, in terms of you're not like making this mistake at the expense of another person, it's okay to make mistakes. It's good to make mistakes. If you don't make mistakes, you will never learn. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. The moment you go into a neighborhood where you are an outsider, just say that I'm a student, I'm here to understand some things, I'm here to learn. I don't know anything about this, and that's okay to say. And I think this honesty people really appreciate. Anytime I've gone into a new context with that sort of honesty, people have always welcomed me, and they open up as much as you open up. And I think people, when it comes to social relations, people mirror you. Anytime I go in feeling hesitant, people look at me with suspicion, ki ye kya kar rahi hai. But when I go in saying like, a bit like with an open mind, that, I'm here because I'm doing this sort of, let's say a research thing. And I'm quite open-minded about it. There's a smile on my face, and people mirror that smile. And I think it becomes easier that way. But as a student, please just go ahead and tell people that you're a student and you're doing this for your. At the end of the day, you're doing it for your marks. Right now, you're doing it to learn, and everyone empathizes with the student.
I wanted to sort of, it's an interesting question, and wonderful to listen to both Swati and Arzu. I think for me, I think it's also a matter of, particularly in the context of pedagogy, for those who are designated faculty members to begin to model the kind of care and politics that one practices in such community contexts, right? So yes, to Swati's point about students have the agency to make mistakes and the sort of the space to be able to be a little more free and less inhibited. But I think that goes to the faculty as well. When I teach, when I work on my research projects, I'm one of the participants. Yes, what my academic and professional education has given me is to understand the value of different moving pieces. And so anytime the students feel a little confused as to where is this going, that's where the faculty as an interlocutor, but faculty as a guide comes in to be able to say that let's trust this process enough to be able to see how the different moving pieces are coming together or not. So I think there has to be a sense of responsibility that one has to both travel with, but also take on when you're sort of assuming positions of collaborative projects. And I just wanted to caution us against sort of, again, thinking of collaboration as if it can be experienced in one go. I think collaboration, quite like equity, it's a process, and that collaboratory logic and or ambition is a kind of a long durée praxis. But what I've experienced in my research and teaching are these moments of tremendous learning from my students and those that are quote unquote not privileged enough to be able to have positions in the academy. And then how does that kind of shift the power relation in ways that all of us become part of that project? And one quick example I wanted to give is that it took me a long time, even though I was living in Ann Arbor, which is about 45 minutes to 50 minutes from Detroit. It took me a long time to be able to bridge that distance physically, but also emotionally and intellectually, because communities that have been overstudied, they know that researchers, I mean, people would come in and they would call this a drive-by research. You just would come in, drive by, and utilize the context and the stories for your own advantage, for your own promotional good. And so it required me to, again, sort of build connections in ways that I was able to identify myself as a foreigner in that context. But the questions that I was asking were much more structural to the discipline in which I was studying. And that helped me sort of connect and create a set of care networks from within which to operate, and then sort of move with that honesty when I reach the farm and say that this is where I am, this is what I don't know, but what I would love to learn is X, Y, and Z. So that was really helpful for me in sort of bridging that divide.
All right, I think we have some audience questions. I'll just, sort of tell you the first question. It's from Deepa Surya Prakash. And the question is for Arzu. Deepa asks, with respect to making books, to start your students at a level ground, do you teach them basic techniques, mediums, and methods? Secondly, how do you push the students' work from the documentation, just noting, to exploration that is being critical using this tool?
I think that those are excellent questions. Yes, definitely techniques and processes, but really what I'm always modeling is this relationship between form and function. So, one of the things that what I love about the accordion is the ability to move across pages. So I'm not limited to one page, or I'm not limited to the fact that the page ends and it turns, and I have to figure out ways to connect. So I'm always encouraging them to problem solve and develop for themselves these relationships between form and function. The same way with the pocket. The pocket is great for collecting fast. I'm in the middle of something. I'm having a really intense experience. I just want to gather. I don't have time to analyze. I don't have the time to sort. So what I do is I develop a physical place that I am able to gather. And so, developing a pocket is excellent for that. And then when I have the time, I come and I sort and I categorize and I kind of have different ways to look at that material. So part of the tools and techniques is not so much, yes, scaffolding some of it, but constantly going back to how does this work for the way you think? So, I am very much of a networked thinker. Some people are circular, some people are more linear. So really having young people excavate for themselves, how is it that I think, and how is this relationship of form and function? So I have a thinking partner out here in this physical thing that I'm manifesting. So, how do you move from documentation to reflection to research? What are the ways to do this? And I mentioned this briefly, but there's many different kinds of strategies. One is just very much saying, you cannot just have a reflection that says, first I did this, then I did this, then I did this, then I did this. What did you feel about it? What were some of the struggles? So, supporting in that way. But having said that, this point of separating observation from assumption and judgment. So a lot of times when we're engaging with the world around us, we're looking at a situation and we're saying, oh, that's why that is there. And it comes from our past or our past experience or from our influences or from things that we've looked at. And so to be able to just name something and observe it and then have the space to, space between that and the judgment we put on top of it. So assumption, whatever it is, put it down, but let's separate it and let's create space between the observation and the assumption, or the judgment, or the the first impulse to explain it, to rationalize it. And then there is where in between that, questions, methods, theories, all of that other part of research come between that space. So that's very much a part of supporting young people in slowly developing that muscle for, kind of moving from documentation to more of an inquiry practice.
I just quickly want to add, Arzu, that, you already know this, but I really loved your work. And like I said, we are also very inspired by the process. We hope to learn from that. But I just love how how tactile it is, in terms of like what you're thinking, you're also interacting with directly. And I think in many ways, it's similar to the approach that we take in that it's so incremental. It doesn't have like a beginning and an end that you have to fill. And as you keep thinking, as you keep growing, it keeps growing. And it's been absolutely delightful to see.
Archita, my last question to Kush and Swati is also sort of in similar line. It would make sense if the thread continues. Would you be kind to read that out, please?
Yes. So Deepa also asks that in your community research projects, particularly field study driven ones, has your preconditioned reading, training, or judgments overruled the process? If and when it did, how did you rechart the course?
How did you reach out? What's the last part?
How did you rechart the course?
Okay.
Kush, frozen for everyone?
Yeah. Kush, you're back.
You're back.
Oh, great. Sorry about that. So I'm going to think through that question and draw from my more recent example of having led a 2-year, 2-semester studio project in south of Trivandrum, in the fishing community of Virinium. And we were sort of, this was a 9th-semester project. And it was crafted and it was theorized as an urban humanities studio, thinking through questions of urban design, not as a best practice in contexts of development, but thinking through questions of equity and colonial erasures that come with even large-scale projects like the recent transshipment project, which is being built as we speak. And so the politics of it was laid bare right up front when we started the project, because these are contestations that are not just, there's no secret to them. I mean, they are there, they're visible. But what the studio started with was to bring together different actors and the kinds of contestations or claims that each one is making to owning the land and sort of developing it for a certain purpose. And so that was how we started, because for me, teaching anti-colonial politics and pedagogy, even in the context of design, starts with understanding the question of land and how land is a kind of a technology that gets to be occupied, that gets to be charted, that gets to be remade. And if as architects, or if as students who are going to be architects, going to be sort of thinking through questions of land in their own practices, how not to see it as a kind of a terrain that's neutral, or a terrain that's even, sans history, and or terrain that could be possibly rebuilt just because of economic and or settler colonial agency. So I think it was important for us to stay rooted to land. What are the histories of that land? How has land been understood, theorized, named? How has the sea been understood, theorized, named? And then what are the ways in which one is able to sort of honor certain histories that are either at the risk of greater uncertainty and erasure for the future, and or are actively reclaiming their own space in modes and mechanisms that would be useful learning for us as architects? That the agency is there among the community members, but how do we then sort of learn from them as a way to sort of understand our own politics and relationships with land and the sea? So I think that honesty goes a long way. And education, as with architecture, is not apolitical, can never be apolitical. So the sooner we sort of make that clear, the process of having students claim a voice and agency for themselves becomes kind of sooner the process, it gets interwoven in the context of the studio, is what I would like to say. Yeah.
For me, I think it's not just in terms of reading, but also mixed with practical experience and learning from others, and mentors, etc. I think I would call it. So I think it's been two different phases. One has involved unlearning what I learned in my Bachelor of Architecture, just that education. And this, the way we look at design and architecture, and the architect as this singular heroic figure who's going to save the day. And honestly, I think most students, I was quite infatuated by that idea. And, when I couldn't find female inspirations, I would look at Franco Gehry and Rem Koolhaas and folks like that, and of course there was Zaha Hadid, one of the well-known female architects. And so I think getting rid of that idea and realizing how unhealthy that is, I mean, even for me and for our entire society, I think that took some time, and then I had good mentors on the way. And of course, then the readings related to related to informal settlements, related to sort of deconstructing the role of the expert, like Kush called it, and just the role of an architect or a designer in the field of community development. I think that helped me learn a lot more. And then when you're working with people, you just see what works and what doesn't work. And if you come from this higher place, you're not really going to go anywhere with that. And for trust building, you need to first understand that you are honest about what you're bringing and what you're learning in the process. And I think there is a friendship which emerges when you're clear about the differences between the two, well, let's say between both of you. I think Kush, you can add to this better, but that's pretty much it.
I want to thank all of you, including yesterday's speakers, because the underlining emerging theme comes down to honesty. Srijana spoke about design ethics yesterday, and we're also speaking about the space between observing and creating your own judgment or slow practice. I think these are important themes that are often not discussed in studios. So I'm really overall thankful to all you speakers, from yesterday and today.
I think I want to add just one thing, that it's still a push and pull. It's still like, I'm always like checking myself, trying to figure out if I'm doing this the right way. And I think that's always going to be the case. And you're constantly learning. So yeah, I just want to add that you've never really figured out that this is your approach, or this is the best way to do anything.
Thank you.
I was just going to invite the other speakers from yesterday also to join the conversation if they're around. That would be wonderful. Alias, Rajna, Mansi.
So as an extension of, Kush's answer, Meera Vasudev has a question for Kush and Swati both. Where does the politics of identity begin to play a role in the system of pedagogy? And there's a sort of follow-up question on that. Does the pedagogy of the oppressed reinstate the condition of being oppressed? And in addition, should the system allow for a kind of raising of consciousness for everyone else?
So thank you. Thanks for the question. I'm sorry, I'm blanking out on the name of the person who's put those questions in the chat bar.
Meera, yeah.
Meera, thank you. Thanks for those questions. So, pedagogy of the digitally oppressed and my sort of teaching and academic practice draws heavily on the writings of Paulo Freire. And there's a particular concept of conscientization that he talks about, which is, it's both cultural action and conscientization. That is how to enable yourself and students to become aware of your environments, the values that each one of us has internalized, and critically reflect on that reality in order to see yourself as collaborative agents of change. So that is the whole project of conscientization, which structures this idea of naming oppressions, but also not reifying them, but actively working on them to be able to create a different world, be part of a world-making, meaning-making, a possibility where your consciousness is not idiosyncratic or personal, but it's again part of that larger collaboratory practice. So that's one way to begin to answer that question. Yeah. I hope Mansi, that was, I see on the screen now. Sorry, was it Mansi or?
It's Meera, yeah.
Meera, sorry, okay. Yeah.
Meera, you could also switch on your video, I guess, at this point. It's a nice, cozy group, so we can as well see each other. And
yeah, Meera, please feel free to ask follow-up questions if anything was unclear.
No, I think that answered it till I think about it a little more.
And Meera, to answer your question, I will also attempt it on politics of identity. So I think an understanding of class, caste, gender, I think this is important, in any work that you do. I think like in architectural education, again, this is not something that we talk about or we think about. In our work, for instance, like Kush was also saying, I have to stop drawing on Kush's points. I can't help it. There's so much resonance. But he was talking about his own background, and in that, so in the work that we're also doing, constantly it's important for me to be mindful of my economic background, where I come from, my caste privilege, and also my gender, and how that in many places it gives me a lot of advantage in the communities I work with, because they're marginalized, because of their economic background, because of caste, because of perceived caste. But in many places, because of my gender, I am marginalized, and so that leads to different situations, different kinds of situations, which is often tricky to navigate around, but at the same time also important to acknowledge. So what I've realized is most of the work that we do in Jhuggi Jhopri, in JJ clusters in Delhi, it's always with men in those communities. And my closest associations are with community leaders who are almost entirely men. There are some where especially Seva is very active, where the community leaders are women, but it's quite rare. And how can we influence that? I mean, of course, we can't, I mean, we're not there to change, any sort of overall social dynamics. But at the same time, what we can do within that is, for instance, if there's a design process where all the decision making is being taken by men, then how can we also involve the women, even if they're not involved in the building process? When it comes to the design feedback, and usually this gets restricted again to interior spaces, but we just make sure that we can either these conversations don't happen in public space, but then they shift to private space, or when they happen to public space in a public space, then how can we make sure that there are more women and more teen girls who can also join in. And when it comes to, I think, my own gender, I think many times my collaborators, because they are men, their presence helps, but over time, I think in any case, when it comes to architecture, women always have to first prove that they're technically sound before people take them, seriously. So that's a constant battle that always happens. But over time, they start seeing the value add that you bring technically. When it comes to social work, though, again, many more women, are involved in social work. So they are used to Didis coming and, talking about sanitation or education. But a Didi coming to build something, with their own hands is a very alien concept. So there are all these, different dynamics that you sort of find your way around, and some of them have led to great friendships. But again, cognizant of the fact that friendships are also not on the same plane. And, these are friendships of different kinds. Huh? There are Facebook friendships, even in our own circle. We have Facebook friends, and then we have really dear friends. And I think it's also important for you to figure out, what are your sort of boundaries. That's very, very important. And also to make the distinction between private space and professional space. Because at the end of the day, when you're working on the field, so to say, it's also it's like working in an office, or it's like working in a studio, and if you are able to keep that aside when you enter home, then you should be able to do that in all aspects of your life. Now, I know people who don't feel the same as me, and they struggle with it. I also struggle with it, but I feel like these boundaries have helped me go on doing the work that I do. So I hope that answers a bit of that question.
Thank you, Swati. And I want to thank all three of you for extremely thought-provocative discussions.
Can I step in for a second, if that's okay? I'd just like to add to what Swati was talking about.
Sure, Alia.
Yes,
Go
of
ahead.
course.
Okay. First of all, thank all three of you for a really wonderful day today, and very, very deeply thought-provoking sessions. I just wanted to share in the chat just a random link, because I spoke about this a little bit yesterday, which is a tool that is used in counseling and psychotherapy, which is the respectful model. And I've taken it from psychotherapy to work with people who are out in the field, and found that it's a really important tool for students to reflect on before they go out to engage with others, because you have to evaluate your own boundaries, like Swati was talking about, against these 10 points in the respectful. And it's a questionnaire format, and when you actually work through it, you realize where your identity locators lie, and what are your cultural competencies, and how they're mirrored in sessions with people, if that is helpful. This is just a very basic link that I've shared here.
Thank you, Alia. We have a few questions from our students. The first question is for Arzu. She says she thoroughly enjoyed all the presentations, and asks, how do we compose the intangibles which grab our attention, like sounds, scents, tactile experiences, etc., as a collection? Do these intangibles get materialized in some way during their translation into a collection?
I think it's an excellent question. Yes, and so I've been trying to think about tools that really sometimes you're collecting things with a photograph, or you're collecting things with your audio recorder, and how do you really make that tactile, and how do you link these things? And there are various platforms that I'm always experimenting with, but part of what I have to really be careful of is that it just doesn't land up in a folder and never make it out of there. And so I'm always trying to think about what are the ways that I am able to continue to keep it present, keep it relational. How do I make that happen? Because the accordion books, that's part of what it is. It's like keeping it up front and close, and not having it get lost as documentation that kind of makes its way around. And there are some really good kind of digital platforms that are starting to do that. And this is a kind of a tangential answer, but the way that many of our digital platforms work, they really influence the way we think. There's been a lot about how PowerPoint influences the way we think, or PowerPoint, Google Slides, that kind of format, or how does Excel influence the way we think. And there are new kind of research platforms. There's an interesting one that I've been using quite a bit called Rome Research, and it really, like the accordion book practice, is very much about network thinking, trying to figure out connections in all of these other ways than just kind of linear modes or tabular modes. So I don't have a specific answer to that, but the thing that I'm always asking my students is, how do you keep it present? How do you keep it usable? How do you keep it accessible? Whether and does it take a shape into another form? Do you translate it? Just like we may translate it into text or sound or things like that, but does it get translated into image? Does it get translated into something visual? And those are the questions. Those are questions in themselves. What are the forms of translation that still allow for it to hold its essence? And what is its essence? So there's a lovely little kind of thinking tool that I use, which is called color symbol image. And a lot of times I'm asking people when they engage with text to think about it in color symbol and image, as a way to translate those ideas and to think about these languages as plural languages. So thinking about a plurilingual way of engaging across, sound, text, image, etc. How do we work in that plurilingual manner?
Thank you for the answer, Arzu. The next question is also from a student, Guru Prasad. The question is for Kush. He asks, how can research help in provoking the oppressed and marginalized middle-class communities in policymaking or rule-making? Is there an example of rule-making and policy-making you have come across while conducting your research that involved oppressed and marginalized middle-class communities?
Yeah, so Guru Prasad, one thing that, of course, given the length of time, I didn't sort of get to talk about was the research in the Detroit context, which also was pedagogical. Culminated in a set of open letters that we wrote to the Smithsonian Institution, which has instituted this massive digital public archive, inviting community gardens and gardeners from around the country to post their narratives in their own voice, whether it's through Word documents, whether it's an image file or sound file. But because the students had done a thorough sort of analysis of that archive, the extent to which its framing is generative and inviting of scales and bodies and identities that are otherwise even minoritized in the larger urban farming movement in the country, it was important that we sort of have this class also speak to this kind of a national organization that was instituting a large project, but also, as I said, serve as interlocutors between folks who are doing work on the ground and use sort of use that time, that trust and the voice of the community to write letters that could then begin to create openings in the archive itself for not just the Oakland Avenue Urban Farm to find its place and see themselves in that archive, but also hopefully to add many more such diverse voices to its collective presence. So I think this connection between place, politics, and policy, they are deeply interconnected, and one has to be intentional. And I remember, I think it was an open question to my students that now that we're working with these oral histories and we have this sense of understanding of what the histories have been and the kinds of visioning that the communities are doing on a day-to-day basis, how would you like to sort of proceed? And it was interesting for the students to lay claim to that position that we cannot and will not speak for the community, but we want to sort of critically engage the archive which is collecting these stories. So I think, as Swati I think mentioned as well, the discourse on policy needs to be structured into undergraduate education, and not policy as something that is esoteric and difficult to understand, but policy as it shows up in day-to-day lives, because ultimately it's those policies which are keeping certain lives oppressed and keeping our systems inequitable and unjust. So I think this question of policy and politics go hand in hand. Yeah. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you for.
Thank you. Thanks, Gurupasa.
All right. So our next question is again by a student Bhakti to Swati. She says, hello to all the speakers, really enjoyed and was a very informative presentation by all of them. Her question to Swati is, how do we as students understand the communities as we are working with secondary information during a pandemic and we can't go and explore ourselves?
Yeah, that's very challenging. I think it's very hard to initiate a relation or a conversation when you haven't met a person before. So, so right now, our course in Ambedkar University, this was urban studies. We were researching about street vendors. The students were, especially because during the pandemic, everyone's working from home and they're in different parts of the country, and so interacting with street vendors is something which is still possible because street vendors are everywhere. Where there's public spaces, there are street vendors. But during the second wave, they were completely, obviously, they're cut off and they couldn't be on ground and speak to them. But at the same time, because they had initiated that contact, it was possible to be in touch with them over phone and also understand, what was going on with them, how it had affected their lives and their livelihoods. But I think to initiate that contact, when you haven't met the person and completely it's only digital, I don't think it's possible. I mean, unless we are, we continue to be in these fourth and fifth and sixth waves, and by then we have come up with systems where we have figured out how to go about it. Yeah, as of today, I think it's hardly, it's very, very challenging, and I think that's not possible. Having said that, I think if you have some sort of connections, then I think some tools can be experimented with. So, for instance, when you're working with the street vendor, the NGOs that work with street vendors, we were able to do consultations with them online using Google Maps and these Zoom calls and Google Meet, etc. And then we were able to sort of figure out where are the markets and how many vendors, etc. But I think to directly talk to people who are not associated, with the NGO and is just a resident in a community, and you want to go talk to that person, I think that would be really hard.
May I just add quickly to Swati's point? I think there's this emerging discourse on digital ethnographies, and what that allows one to do is to quite like what Swati said, of course, identify the organizations that have long worked with the people on the ground, because that's where those connections are. But also think about simple devices that a lot of people use, including in India, where mobile phones, of course, there's a whole class and gender dynamic to who gets to use mobile phones. But there's some very interesting sort of insights on the connections between smart cities and gender that's coming out of understanding how mobile phones are being used by women of a certain age group. and connecting through those mobile phones, whether it's through simple social media channels or even through WhatsApp and texting, and then sort of understanding what and how those connections, which are always kind of wired, are lending themselves to sort of thinking about the digital material life that's really all-encompassing for us today. So I think the nuances have to be considered, and this is not just something coming out of the pandemic, but digital engagements have long been part and parcel of how parts of the world have even connected without having physically met to begin with. But again, the care has to be taken, the ethics have to be in place, and questions have to be generative enough to be able to course correct as you move along as well. Yeah.
Arzu, would you also like to respond to that?
Well, I think that both Swati and Kush have made this point about who is the intermediary where trust exists. Right. So the whole point of somebody even being willing to, this entire semester, my students have been working with creative dignity of crafts communities, and it's been so important trying to find who is that trustworthy person within creative dignity and their network. And we have done all of our stuff on WhatsApp. What's a combination of WhatsApp text and WhatsApp calls, and entire processes being shared back and forth, and in the entire final semester thesis projects being just developed with these WhatsApp relationships. And the short video format is really interesting, as a form that is emerging, and in the kind of dialogue back and forth between people. But I think that the point is that, are you able to find that intermediary point of trust? And also, again, how are these, I think there's been a lot of questions amongst my students about with the digital space, it becomes, what happens to that material? How does it get used? And how are the ethics of it still, how do we develop kind of new ethical guidelines for that material that gets used in terms of these messages and videos and things like that get exchanged. But I feel that that's going to be a really interesting whole area of research in itself, just in terms of connecting people through these as Kush was mentioning, very basic digital platforms. I think the other thing too is that since so many kids have is online school as a format, and when you're talking about rural communities, people are working and doing online school and all of that, and it's opening up a whole set of worlds, I think, about how people will communicate, how people can communicate, and I'm curious to see where it goes.
Definitely an exciting time for, to see how the pedagogy itself is evolving because of this, and the ways in which one does research itself. The next question is also for Arzu. It's from our student Viksha. And she says, how do you locate an idea or find a starting point and an end point in the accordion format? Do you ever get lost in your book? And has that ever led you to discover something unexpected?
So there's multiple ways to, ask that question. A lot of times, you might already have a starting point, or you might not. And for people who don't have a starting point, I think the collections are a great way to start. So thinking about what is it that's catching and holding your attention, and how do you start to develop your collections of the things that catch and hold your attention. And just by starting to play with that material, organize it, sort it, relate it, map with it, you will start to see areas that are of interest to you, or are curiosities that start to develop, and that becomes multiple starting points. So that's one piece of it. Now, in terms of physicalizing this, a lot of the times my accordions, and I really encourage this, is using recycled material, so there's not a preciousness that comes up around how to keep these things going, but the ability to just say, I'm going to tear this and stick it here because it makes more sense here, and moving ideas around and their relational dynamics around, so that they start to become more generative. I think that sometimes developing tools to, and this is where the coding, I was talking about coding, you have to engage with just collections for a while and then come back and start coding them. And then you start to see things in all of these different ways when you start coding the material that you have, or you realize that themes are coming up over and over and over again. Part of it is just being alert to the themes that are coming up, and then deciding, okay, I'm going to just follow this line of thought, or I'm going to follow that line of thought. There's the physical aspect of it, and in terms of developing extensions and flaps that go off of an idea, or an idea starts to gain density. And then there is the coding and the themes of it, and seeing patterns that come up over and over again, and being alert to that. So, for a lot of people who've engaged with this practice, and I see this with other educators who are using this, they say that you start to kind of develop a way of thinking around it, and the physical material starts to influence the way you think, and then sometimes then you don't even need the accordion practice, because you're thinking in these networked ways, you're thinking in these connected ways. And you start to kind of develop a way of inquiry, and a process of questioning, and a process of delving into questions, because you just immersed in the physical process for a little while, and that has developed this relationship with your mental processes.
Thank you for the answer, Arzu. It's also in sort of what Swati was talking about in our presentation, that, research is detective work and the unfolding of patterns across, and then suddenly you see new connections, and, you sort of take the trail and go off. All right. The next question is from our student Anjali. The question is for Swati. She asks, she says that I was really fascinated by the idea of incorporating farms into our urban fabric. My question is, how do you think, if you think it's possible, to integrate farms into the urban fabric as a second thought in places where maybe the master planning never considered this possibility?
Yeah, I think it's very much possible. What's needed is land, I think, which is a very valuable resource. In the case of Delhi, we already have farming and it's being removed. So I think that's something that's very painful. But where you don't already have farming and you want to introduce it, it's very much possible. I'm not a big fan of how urban farming is being perceived in terms of building these high rises and then creating these vertical farms and greening the terraces and greening the balconies, and usually these are just renders. I haven't really seen many buildings which actually have been done this way. I think there's one in China which was in the news recently, because now they have so many mosquitoes and rodents in the building that they don't know how to deal with that. So we definitely, I think we are tweaking with nature so much that we don't know how to cope with it. But on land, I feel I'm also realizing I'm very old school, and yeah, maybe I'm a bit older than I look. But on land, it's very much possible, and I think even kitchen gardening should be seen as one form of that, right? And so many of us do that. And whatever the economic background, in the settlements that we work with, in the squatter settlements, people always find a patch of land where they're growing tomatoes, chilies, and other sort of vegetables they need for cooking. And these are often shared, or where there's no space, then even on a tin roof, you grow it, on your roof, or there's a concrete slab, you have pots, and you just manage to create space. Especially, when resources are limited, you make sure that you are able to grow your own food. And when you have access to land, then definitely you can go about it. At a master planning level, it's helpful if the authorities think of it, but I think often the best strategies and solutions come from the people themselves, and I think civil societies and also collectives where people have mobilized themselves. And you can see these examples from across the world, where people have come together, formed cooperatives, and created such farms across cities. So very many models to look at.
The next question is from Aziz Rajani. He says, in continuation to Meera's and Swati's point, could selective representation, voice of the minorities, in a collaboration be a starting point in a collaboration?
Yeah, I was reading that question. I think in all the work that we've done so far, it's always been the starting point, meaning to say we've always started anything because that need or that inquiry has come from either a social worker who works in a JJ cluster or a resident. And I think, so that's been always the starting point so far. For example, we ended up building an Anganwadi after there was a fire in this community, which is under a metro line, or the metro line was built over it, let's say. And so we were thinking about ways of sort of rebuilding, which were more durable and more fire resistant. And then everyone decided that we should build one model. And then we were thinking about whether it should be someone's house or it should be a educational space, a community space, and everyone narrowed down on Anganwadi. So we decided to build an Anganwadi together, and that led to many more things. Having said that, I also want to add that many times, I also see many projects which are self-initiated, which I think is a good idea, if you want to learn and also benefit others. But at the same time, it's very important to think about the need for the project. And I think it can become really problematic if we keep pushing a project because we've got funding for it, or because we want to do something and it looks good in a portfolio. And there are many young practices and I really want to also support them. So I hope if they're listening, they don't feel that, oh no, there is no merit to what I'm doing. But I think always go back to the basics and evaluate who came up with the need. And even if you came up with the need, did you go and talk to the people who you're working with, whether it is their need? And in the hierarchy, on the priority list, how much time or how much effort do they want to put on it? So yeah, I think that's very, very important to consider, because in the long run, it won't work in any case if the need hasn't come from them.
May I just add to Swati's excellent points? This question also makes me think that as long as the quote unquote minority is not tokenized, right? Because sometimes even if they are part of the starting point, then as Swati is mentioning, that those projects will not have a life that one is starting with, even with their inclusion. And so one of the things that I do with students is to sort of understand the distinction between groups that have been labeled minority and conditions that are minoritizing. And sort of when we move from minority to minoritized, then one begins to understand what are the structural conditions that are keeping these inequities intact. And therein lies the sort of the need for specific voices to be part of a project right from the get-go, but also structuring the process in ways that continues to be equitable through and through. So it's just a kind of a check-in that I encourage my students to do always in their own projects or practices.
Archita, if there are no more questions, can I ask one?
Yes. I also have a question.
Wonderful.
So after
you take precedence. Go ahead. I go after you. Yeah.
All right. So my question is for Swati. And Swati, your presentation sort of really highlighted the role of an architect, and it's also redefining what designing is. And designing is not just putting pen to paper and drawing on your tracing. It's also about, you spoke about making of the manuals and prototyping in so many ways. So my question for you is, I would like to know what the structure of your office is like. Who is in the office, and what are the roles of those individuals, and how? I understand you have a lot of collaborators, but I'm sort of interested in how big your studio is.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. There are a few new interns, two new interns who have joined our office. So I asked them to attend this session because I said, you will then learn, what we have been up to and what we think. We have a very small office. We only have at any time 3 to 4 people, including me. Okay, let's say 4 to 5 people, including me, and young designers because we have very limited resources. So I think the role of the architect, since you had mentioned it, I also wanted to just say that we also need to think of ourselves as facilitators, and that's what at least I have realized. Working in the fields that we work in, that I'm more of a facilitator, and I think often architects take up the role of project, management, project coordination. I think this is exactly what it looks like, which is getting people together, from different parts of life, different backgrounds, and then finding a solution together. And I think designers can really play this role well. At the same time, I think the fact that our practice is very interdisciplinary, because of the collaborations, it also makes me think that in a way we lie at the periphery of every field. Because our work lies at the intersection of different fields. So if you take architecture, and if you take, let's say, economics, and if you take law, it's somewhere between the three that some of our work lies. And so in a way, and I think many of the people who work with us often feel that they don't belong anywhere, but I also think that we belong everywhere. If you think about it, these sort of in-between spaces. And I think working at the intersections of different fields also really helps you see that one field from outside, right? And you can look at it critically. So I really struggle with the field of architecture. Often I feel that I am a part of that network, but often I feel that everything I do is anti-architecture. It's not really my fraternity. So I'm so critical of them all the time. But that's because I really care about them, And it's the same with my country as well. I'm like super critical of the government and everything we do. And then at the bottom of it lies the fact that I love it so much, and I want things to run well. Anyways, to answer your question, we are a very small setup, and usually we get asked, how do we financially sustain ourselves? So no one asked us that today, but I'll just quickly say it's very hard, and it's a series of grants and small like collaborations and consultations that keeps us going. But like most of our work, we are also incremental and iterative, meaning to say we are seeing how it grows. Right now we are like a lab, experimenting with different things, and then whatever makes more sense, we will continue to do that. And maybe the scale will always be small. I'm quite comfortable with the scale, small to medium. I think there is something you lose when you go on to that, large scale. So perhaps that's something we won't go on to. Never know. Let's see.
Salila, I'd like to come in here before you ask your question, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Because it is in the same vein, in a sense, and it's not a question but more of a understanding of what we have seen today. Is somewhere the theme inadvertently has emerged of emerging practices, right? Of how an architect has been an observer in the sense a student. We are only projecting, discussing what is going on, right? Describing a life that one doesn't lead, in a sense, as opposed to being a participant. Then you're asking the question, not what is going on, but what to do, because you're in it. And in a sense, it feels like it's you're arranging your own life because you're so part of this, of the things that are happening around you, right? So it almost feels like it's going to be highly influenced and opportunistic, a solution that comes out of that. To something that Swati just spoke about, she's called it her office a lab. Okay, and I find that even more interesting. And I think it is one step beyond that is the idea of the larger collaborative, right? So I'd like to put this to all three of them, and it's to all three of our speakers today, and ask them, how do you ever look at it as, observer, participant, lab, and collaborative? Is there something that you do consciously, or something that you have developed over the years to negotiate these three ideas? right? The idea of the observer, the participant, and the idea of a collaborator, part of a much larger collaborative. I'm sorry if that was not a question and more of a comment. If you need to take time, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was only smiling because I was hoping that Arzu or Kush would go first.
Okay.
Yes, if they went in the alphabetical order, yes, Arzu could get started.
I think that this is an interesting space, and I'm going to kind of answer it in two ways, because I think that the practices also determine how we think about this. So, Ali and I have used the metro station as an education space, and not necessarily calling it education, but we run workshops out of the empty spaces in the metro station, and it's open to everybody to come and join. And that's been a really interesting kind of in-between space. It's been a fantastic space for students, but just in terms of public conversation, who comes in, who engages, having mixed age, 8 to 80-year-olds in the same workshop, a multilingual space. This kind of mix has been extremely generative, and there one is not necessarily thinking about collaborators, but one is thinking about participants, and one is thinking about participants in a city. So, with the Memory Maps project, or with some of the other workshops that we have done, there's been a really this idea of who is a participant, and especially when it's a free workshop in a public space, which is a corner of a station, and you're sitting on the floor and you're running this workshop. There's a very interesting idea of, how does somebody feel willing to enter? How does somebody feel willing to participate? And the curiosities that come from that. And for students, running a series of experiments that are looking at this idea of participation, this idea of residue, this idea of the potential to interact with people, like in a transient space like the metro station. We've had students run so many experiments where people are engaging with something, and you don't see the person who's engaged with it before, but you know that you're engaging with something that somebody else has done. And so there's this kind of continuous cyclic manner that is a very kind of interesting space and not so distinct. Now, that's kind of one place that I've really been thinking about, I guess, in the same way that you're questioning this. It's been an interesting space for me to question, and with students as well. The other is that, in terms of the accordion book work, we've been running these kind of week-long, I guess, residencies or kind of community workshops where it's teacher, student, and student teacher. So people who are studying to become educators, and they form these triads, and they look at artistic process and their own process. And that's been a really interesting space, particularly around the work of the Accordion Book Project, because so much of it is about agency and about feeling that and developing your own practice. And the conversations that break down between teacher, and student in this space has been something that has actually led me to my current research, which is really looking at these books as forms of challenging assessment forms, or challenging the way understanding is accepted, or the way understanding is validated. And so it's trying to kind of figure out how do we create these different permutations and combinations to engage more in what does it mean to learn, what does it mean to to be in a growth space. So I've been really interested in these kind of odd mixes and odd situations, and what one can develop from that in terms of challenging the norms of education, challenging the norms of learning, challenging the norms of participation, challenging the norms of collaboration in itself. I'm sorry that was a very vague and long-winded answer, but it's something that is a very interesting space to me.
Yeah, Madhuri, I mean, if I understood your question correctly, one way to begin to sort of think about it is the kind of practice that students, professionals, designers get to claim for themselves, right? And for me and my partners at Pedagogy of the Digitally Oppressed, we were very intentional in calling it a collective. Because there was a certain specificity to why the three of us came together, or how the three of us came together from very disparate fields. Me from architecture and urbanism, Ashley Corrado-Morford is a scholar of English and Philippine Exeo studies and indigenous studies, and Arun Jacob comes with a background in cultural studies, labor studies, and is currently pursuing his PhD in media studies. So there was a very deliberate sort of coming together of questions that each one of us were bringing to digital humanities. And that was the sort of the origin of how we saw ourselves as a collective, in which we were observing the kinds of disconnects, the kinds of erasures, the kinds of co-optation of terms and concepts that are happening and were happening in higher education, particularly at the intersection of arts, humanities, and design. So we were observing. We were also, and we continue to be, participants in the academic spaces, in the institutional spaces that we inhabit, because this is a transnational practice. And we are very intentional about collaborations that we forge much more micro-locally. So for example, in the sort of projects that I sort of a 2-year project or engagement with the fishing community in south of Kerala was very intentional, but was very hyper-local to the context in which I was working and living and thinking about. And so the collaborations is also part of it, but then it becomes part, there's a very conscious layering of how that takes place. So collective is what, for me or for my partners, brings a specificity in terms of questions, politics, orientation. Observations is what we are observing in the field of higher education, in sort of institutional structures as they're being made and remade. And collaborations which land themselves much more hyper-locally in the places where we find ourselves, so that those collaborations are then refueling and reinforming the kind of meaning making and researching and teaching that we're doing as a collective. So it's in that loop that I would like to sort of describe where we are, who we are, and how we came to be. Thanks.
I'll keep my answer short. I think at least in our field of work, there are no observers, or at least like we don't think of ourselves as observers. If there is any any consultation, if there's any project, if there is any sort of I mean, in the process, I think everyone who is involved in any way is a participant. And also, like Kush said, again, I'm borrowing from him, but there are layers of collaboration. I think all the participants are involved in different ways, some, in a core involvement sort of a way, and some more at a periphery, let's say. So for me, I think there is only like the participant and collaborator, and they overlap hugely.
Okay, I know we are running over time, but I just have to ask this question, and it's a very short question, I hope. Yeah. And this is for everyone, for Ali and Mansi and Kush and Arzu and Swati. So I think in putting this event together, we very consciously selected the speakers that are working in, and I mean the terms collective and using different innovative ways of research. And I think that's one reason we were drawn to your work, and that's why we invited you. And I think it's been amazing. So I just wanted to know, do you see, and you're also teaching, right? All of you are teaching as well. So do you see you're practicing and teaching, either researching or teaching and doing projects? So do you see a growth or a trend towards more research in this direction from others as well? I mean, in general, do you see this growing, or is it still something that's very niche and it's just like Swati said, a small office, right? And it's like, it's sometimes scaling up some things becomes very difficult, even in terms of research methods, I guess, or developing a new paradigm or school of researching. And also to build on what Kush had started with when he talked about the idea of decolonizing our research also, and the methods, and contextualizing it more. So do you see any kind of, is there space for hope there? Do you see that happening more and more? Do you see more people working like you do? I know it's very broad, but I was hoping each of you could quickly comment on that.
I think we could go in the reverse order this time. So Swati, do you want to begin?
Okay, I will conclude quickly. I was very tired. It's been 3 hours.
I know.
But I think
it could be yes or no to Swati, but that wouldn't be a very good research answer.
No, I'll just take 3 sentences, let's say. I teach because I think that this is exactly why I teach, that because I hope there are more practices like ours. And I think at an education level is where we need to be talking about these issues. Simply because in my architectural education, I feel I did not get that sort of exposure, is why I'm trying to teach. And it is making a difference. And I see already the kind of students who are emerging and the kind of work they are doing. It's very different from the work that I was doing. So yeah, definitely. And I think there are more practices like ours. Like I said, I think you also need to think of why you're doing what you're doing. And at the end of the day, what's the final difference or impact that you're hoping to make? It's always important to keep that in mind, because sometimes we get a bit way late, and then in any case, the project will not work. I mean, whatever you're trying to accomplish will not work unless you have done it. Your starting point, has been, let's say, from the community that you're working in. So yeah, I hope that was 3 lines. I think it was a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, one would hope that these critiques and critical pedagogies and scholarship is bridging many more worlds and is building many more worlds. So when I use the term world making, it's not just about sort of this. It's not at all a utopian idea of a world that is not here with us right now, right here, but thinking about again. Our role as collaborators at its very heart and essence. And that's something that I tell students as well, that, one of the questions that I often ask is, what are the critiques and pedagogies that we must produce in order to see ourselves as collaborative agents of change, progressive change? And then if that is, that's the kind of question that I lead with in my teaching, as a way for students to then begin to claim their own ideas of practice with collaboration at the core. But then, for example, one of my students says, how is it that we've never heard of a social worker and architect? Mm-hmm. What would that practice look like, feel like? Right. Or a marine biologist who's also an architect. And I think we need to open up this discourse towards those possibilities, so that research, again, is not seen in this very narrow, scientific, ossified way in which it has been kind of understood, or what Linda Tui Weiss-Smith refers to as a dirty word. But then it becomes part and parcel of life and life making. And I think there is a potential, and there is a real opportunity there. Yeah.
I have a couple of different ways I'm going to respond to this. I think that, and I don't know if I'm speaking for Kush and Swati here, but because one teaches at the college level, one has in some ways, and institutions that are open to this, one is able to engage as, for myself, artist, teacher, researcher. It took me, I knew that even as a young undergraduate, even before my postgraduate work, I knew that that's what I wanted for my own practice, but it was very hard. I got consumed as a teacher and didn't have an art practice or a research practice at all. And then I kind of went into research and didn't have an art practice or a teaching practice at all. And so trying to find this kind of sweet spot of managing an artistic practice, a research practice, and a teaching practice, and continuing to advocate for it even at the institutions that we work at, which are open to this, but still, how much time am I able to get for my artist practice, and how do I advocate for that at an institution that's supposedly open to it and giving me space for it? So this need to advocate for the fact that this is the whole practitioner, and that whole practitioner needs that support. And how do we create institutionally supports for these kinds of things at multiple institutions, not just at academic institutions or at the college level or design institutions? So this is an interesting question, and it's also been a pursuit of trying to find that kind of that sweet spot. I think also publicly, how do we kind of nudge other organizations to be able to see this, and I think that with the work with Art in Transit, we had Mr. Vasant Rao, who was at the Bangalore Metro, who really he had a vision, and he was able to see something that many of his colleagues were not able to see. He was able to see that we were not a design firm or a product kind of development organization. We were a learning organization. That education and research and teaching were very much a part of the work that we were going to be doing with the Metro. And it was because he was able to advocate for it that, we were able to sustain for so long, because otherwise it would have just been, what are you guys delivering? As opposed to, this is a learning process for students, or this is an education space within the public sphere. So how do we make other organizations much more aware of a learning model of practice, right? So we're thinking about not just a product model of practice, but process. And this is why I really appreciate this session, because you have been focusing on process, and everybody and each of the speakers has been focusing on process and the care and attention one needs to give to process. And I was engaged in some really interesting conversations about public art policies that are being developed, and people and the government is unable to think about process as a critical piece of it, and community participation as a critical piece for funding to come in at a policy level, because when you're thinking about public art, you're not thinking about urban design, but they are interrelated, and you don't even, and you're having to advocate for process being an integral part of anything that happens with these institutions. So this conversation is at multiple levels, and so I just want to kind of make that visible.
Thanks, Arzu. Mansi?
I think personally, having found myself at the intersection of architecture and material culture research, I think when you start looking at any kind of cultural research, it's impossible to remove decolonization from the equation. And I think Kush has spoken so wonderfully about the need for anti-colonial approaches and decolonization in research today. And what I've come to realize is that the methods and tools available to us and accessible to us are so situated in colonial constructs, like per se, of let's say anthropology or material culture research, or the museum itself, a highly colonial, historically colonial institution. So I think there's been this need to constantly question the methods and tools that are accessible already, and to see what you can unlearn, what you can relearn, what you can sort of come up with as new methods for research. And in that is, I think a lot of people who we end up coming over to work with us struggle because you're conditioned to think a certain way. And also because the center being situated at Sept University, there's a lot of architectural people with architectural background who come in. And then to, much like Swati has spoken today, to unlearn what you learn in architecture, where you have absolutely no exposure to other disciplines or this intersectional approach, of understanding space, of understanding communities and people. We work with people who build our spaces, and so I think that unlearning process takes a long time. And personally, like responding directly to your question, what we've realized is with people who come into work these days, they want everything quick, and quick does not come, in research. So instilling this idea of slow practice, like Swati's been talking about, that's been a huge challenge for us. You have to invest that time. But yes, I think as practitioners, there's a lot of awareness, a lot of self-reflexivity that's building up within the space of material culture and museums and architecture. So I think that's a promising aspect.
Thanks, Mansi. Ali? Ali, you noted.
Yeah, I'm going to take parts of your question and answer them really simply. The first was about scale, and that's something that I've struggled with a lot. I mean, struggle as in a decision to scale or not to scale. And I think the collaborative model is where I find opportunities for scale, and that has worked well, very well for me. And that leads to the second thing that I want to say, which is that the collaborative model for me allows for scale. It allows me to retreat and withdraw and manage those relationships, and as well as opening it out to, like Arzu said, at multiple levels, a 2-way, 3-way, 4-way engagement. And finally, the intersectionality that we were talking about today, Arzu and I have also discussed this many times, and I'm speaking with with context to Bangalore. We have often said that we do not have the conversations or the dialogues or the networks, even in this city, for the social worker to be able to meet and explore opportunities with someone else and to be able to work across disciplines. And I'm not sure why that still doesn't exist even in a city as small as ours, where we don't have opportunities to have those dialogues. But yes, having walked with so many groups, the last part of your question is that I have seen, and I'm very happy to see a lot of people who come for the workshops who move out of that space and continue to take that approach forward in their practice as well. That's very heartening.
Yes.
So thank you.
Thanks, Ali. I think, Archita, that's the questions, right? And thank you so much for doing the Q&A. I think it's high time we wrapped up. Madhuri, so I'll just do my bit now. So the final comments. I now have the not so happy task of marking the end of our symposium, and then the happy task of thanking everyone for making this possible. So yesterday I had started my introduction with Helen Deutsch's quote that the ultimate goal of research is not objectivity, but the truth. Our speakers have proved Deutsch right in the process of sharing their own journeys and methods in research. Their work shows that research has the potential to reveal the truth, and even better, as you just shared, it gives us hope as well. It shows us hope. And I'm sure I speak for all attendees when I say that these days have given me so much to reflect on and discuss and hope for. However, I will restrict myself to briefly stating 5 points that this symposium highlighted for all makers and custodians of art-built and unbuilt environments. 1, embrace concepts of intersectionality, multiplicity, and interconnectedness in your work. It is difficult and not always possible, but the results are worth the effort. 2, integrate flexibility and rigor in your research process. There are no fixed, quick, or easy solutions. 3, work on formulating and asking the right questions, no matter how long that takes. If we don't ask the right questions, how will we find the right answers? 4, discard the myth of the researcher as a lone crusader, toiling away in an ivory tower in glorified isolation. The methods our speakers discussed amply demonstrate that talking and learning from the communities that we work with and work for can bring us closer to answers that matter. 5. In your journey to self-empowerment, since knowledge after all is power, strive to empower and tell the stories of the communities that you learn so much from. Share your work with them and the world. Knowledge unshared is knowledge unused. So with those closing thoughts, on behalf of Madhuri and me, I would like to give thanks to everyone who made this symposium possible. I thank our institution and its trustees, our principal, Dr. O.P. Bhavne, and our dean, Professor Suresh Murthy, for their encouragement and help. A big thank you to our wonderful speakers, Aliye, Mansi, Srajana, Kush, Arzu, and Swati, for generously sharing their time and enriching experiences with us. And I sincerely hope that this has brought, having come onto the same platform, we keep talking to each other, and keep this going forward, the conversations. Deep gratitude to Deepa Suryaprakash, Meera Vasudev, and Archita Banerjee for their presence and help. Many thanks to Sanjeev, whose technical help made it possible for us all to organize, meet, and talk. Thanks to our wonderful students Anjali, Bhakti, Ari, and Viksha for their spirit of volunteerism and support. Finally, a public event would not mean much without an audience that attends and participates. So a big thanks to our attendees for spending these 2 evenings with us. Thank you all and have a lovely weekend, and hope to see you all in person sometime soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Salila.
Thank you so
Thanks.
much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank